All right, now it's time for some good debate with Nolan Finley from the Detroit News and Stephen Henderson of WDET after the election dust is settled. Last week, Governor Rick Snyder had his exit interview at the Detroit Econ Club. Kind of thought it was a little too early for an exit interview because I'm thinking that he might have a little bit more work to do in the next couple of weeks here.
It could be really frantic work, right?
Yeah, as we head into lame duck here. But what did you kind of take out of that when he spoke at the DEC, Nolan?
Well, I mean, I didn't get the feeling that he's done. I mean, as you said, he's got some work to do. Wasn't a whole lot of reminiscing. He did talk about where the state has come under his leadership and the things he's proud of. But mostly he was talking about what the state still needs to do and what our political process needs to look like. He spoke a long time about civility and his concerns about our inability to get along, both as citizens, but also as politicians trying to make effective policy for the state. That was heavy on his mind. It seemed like he devoted the bulk of his talk to the need to improve our relations.
We've talked about the need for civility, but I think what that means to people can be very, very different in terms of how you speak out against maybe policy that you don't believe in, and you believe it's time to be a little uncivil about it.
That's funny because Hillary Clinton last week said, well, we can return to civility when we get a Democrat back in the White House. I was thinking that's probably not the idea.
So I guess how far have we come in that civility conversation?
The problem is historically, words like that have been used by those in power to keep those without power from challenging that power. And so it's kind of a give up to go along kind of tool, and you want to be wary of that. There is a distinction between giving up and being able to talk about differences passionately and excitedly and working toward solutions.
I was just going to say, more than just talking about it, but being able to craft policy that is going to be effective for the state, and looking at two things really and coming up in the future and what Michigan's going to have to decide on education and I think on infrastructure.
So if you go back to before the Flint water crisis, and this governor had just been reelected, kept his majorities in the Senate and the House, he was already expressing real frustration in his own party with the ability to get things done. He had accomplished some really important things in the first term, and he had a second term agenda. That legislature was not interested in an awful lot of that. And I think what he was talking about at the Econ Club was that period where there was an opportunity. They had one party rule in Lansing. They should have been able to get a whole lot of other things off their plate.
But in terms of this, what he did get done, pretty amazing, the agenda he did tick off in his first term. He got almost everything he wanted in that first term, except roads, and he never did
roads and education.
Roads to the full extent he wanted. And
education didn't come up until the second term, but that's a huge part of what we're doing here.
I'm not sure he asked the legislature for anything in terms of education. I would put that on him. He failed to come up with that big, bold idea. And if I were faulting his 8 years, that's where I'd lay the fault. He never came up with the big, bold idea to change education. But if you think the business leaders report that was out this week, if you think about where the state has come since 2008, by every measure, we've surged ahead. I don't think anybody could have looked at where we were and where we are today and imagined it would have been possible.
So a couple other things happened in the world while that was going on. The country recovered, and a lot of the things that we saw happen here were about that recovery. The auto industry recovered because you had a federal administration intervene and save two of the companies from bankruptcy. I don't know that Governor Snyder can claim credit for that, although certainly he did things to help make that matter more. The other thing that's happened, though, over this time period is, again, this widening of the gap. The pay gap, the wealth gap in this country, that's particularly pronounced in Michigan when you're talking about urban areas. Detroit, we spent a lot of money making sure that Detroit would not go bankrupt. We haven't yet figured out a way to make sure that the people of Detroit have living wages, have opportunity for education, have safety and all these other kinds of things. I mean, he deserves credit for some things, but he also deserves blame for not dealing with things across that economic spectrum. If you're a poor person, especially if you live in the city of Flint, is this a better state today than it was 8 years ago? It is not.
It's in a lot of ways it is, even if you live in Flint. Employment.
I don't hear anyone in Flint saying
employment in urban areas is up. Actually, there's a very positive attitude in Flint because the governor and others have tried to help bring development into the city, jobs.
Yeah, but I would say that they've lost their trust in government for the rest of time.
This administration.
They have that, but you look at what's happening in Flint. There's economic development happening, and there's jobs being created. Not to this extent. Flint was a city that was in deep trouble before.
Actually, that's really unfair.
The state did have to come in and help after that.
You look at urban Michigan, Detroit and other urban cities, employment's up, household income's rising, policies matter. The governor, we didn't just benefit from the nation's recovery. Remember, the nation was doing well while we were failing because before the recession, because our tax structure was broken, our business taxes were a mess. He fixed those business taxes. You got businesses and economic development coming here that wasn't coming here before and wouldn't have come here without those reforms.
At the same time, he also instituted a tax on retired people. I mean, these were not
pensions.
So these were not tax breaks. These were tax shifts. What he did was he took the taxes off business and put them on individuals, and for the most part,
in that extent, Steve, he made the tax system more fair. If you're a retiree with a pension under the old system, you weren't taxed. If you were a retiree with a 401k and no pension, you were taxed. If you were a retiree whose retirement plan was working in McDonald's, you were taxed to the full extent. It was an uneven,
let me ask
unfair
you this.
system.
So now in these final last couple of weeks in lame duck, what things are you think that you're going to be seeing in lame duck session that's going to maybe codify some of those financial decisions that Governor Snyder was able to do?
And that's the key. I think you hit it right on the head. You got to codify the good government practices put in place. Balanced budget passed early, 2-year budgeting plan, long-term debt payoff. You should codify all that so it's there in place. We don't have to worry about it again. It just happens automatically.
Well, I'm not sure you codify that kind of thing. Those are the kinds of things that are discretion of the executive. The new governor has a right to take a look at all of those things, decide which ones she wants to do, which ones she might do differently. This idea of battening down the hatches before you get out the door so that nothing that you did can be changed is an odd sense of legacy. I do think the new governor should look at some of those things and say, hey, let's continue these, right? 2-year budgeting makes a lot of sense. There's no reason that she's going to back away from that, I don't think, just because she's of a different party. It's kind of thumb your nose at the idea of a Democrat coming in to say, we're going to make this into law rather than discretion.
I know it's a little early, but what else would we see in lame duck, do you think?
Well, they've got to deal with that. The legislature took on this minimum wage and family leave proposal. Now they've got to do something with it. And they can't alter it too much from what the people who signed those petitions wanted. I think they should have let it go to the ballot box and made an argument against it. They chose not to do it. Now it's in their laps. They've got to come up with a plan.
Yeah. I mean, they've talked unconstitutionally about just rolling it all back or rolling it back significantly. They cannot do that. This was a cynical move from the beginning. This was meant to thwart an effort by the people to do something that probably would have passed at the ballot box. Now they got to live with the consequences.
Maybe not. I think it should have went there. If they were going to do it for any proposal, they should have done it with the marijuana proposal, because the legislation on that now is going to be impossible to write.
All right, well, we're going to see what happens after the Thanksgiving break. You guys want more coffee because the espresso machine's been working overtime.
I was going to say, it was loud back there.
It's been working overtime behind us.